And now let's take a closer look at the Japanese aggression shown towards China all those years ago during the Second World War. Those who don't know history are doomed to repeat it. When part of our history is war, it is certainly important that we know it and know why it happened and to ensure it is not going to be repeated. That's why today we are bringing you a personal account from a young Chinese woman about her family's history during the Second World War. After all, Saturday marks the 70th anniversary of the end of the war. Anne Feng is in her 20s, originally coming from Beijing. She is now a PhD candidate of art history at the University of Chicago. After growing up in both China and the US, she grew interested in her family history, especially the stories of her grandpa, Feng Zhongyun, a young intellect who decided as early as his university days to devote his life to the fight against invaders, then the Japanese army. For years, Feng, the grandpa, fought guerrilla wars in Côte d'Ivoire in northeastern part of China. Those were among the bloodiest battles of China's war against the Japanese aggression, an important part of the Asian theater against the fascists. I had a talk earlier with Anne the other day in Beijing at her home. She studied intensely about her grandpa's stories, including the extreme cold weather they endured on a daily basis.
The most difficult time was they had a lot of support from villagers that was secretly helping them, but then the Japanese kind of combined all the villagers together to supervise them, so they even lost that support. And Manchuria is very, very cold. It would drop down to -30, -40 and have blizzards very commonly in the winter. And there was a point when times that they had to eat their own belts, they had to eat leaves to survive, and clothing was never enough.
What was it like for him to see so many of his colleagues just gone, just like that?
Of course, I can't really think back about war as something so different. Just coming from one of the stories that my mother told me. So I was in Harbin at a funeral. My mother said, "You had to go." And I was like, "I don't know this person, why are we going?" So I went to the funeral, and my mother said that this person once saved your grandfather's life. And I was like, so what was the story? And my mother said, in the woods, they were having my grandfather there.
They were fighting in the forests.
Yes, and they had like this secret meeting in a little house. But then the Japanese came, so they were attacked under surprise. So everyone was killed. Most of the people were killed. And my grandfather was just completely shocked because he luckily survived this kind of attack. And he was just kind of not very, he wanted to bury his friends on site. He couldn't leave them there. And he was in emotional stress and couldn't really deal with the situation. And then this person that I went to the funeral with, he dragged my grandfather away. He said, "The Japanese are coming again, you have to leave." And they did come back. So it was really this person that rescued him. So that's why even today, like, I remember going to this person's funeral in Harbin.
There are many well-known stories for the guerrilla warfare in northeast part of China or Manchuria. For example, Yang Jingyu story.
Yes.
Tell us about that story, because many of our international viewers might not necessarily know, first of all. And secondly, how did your grandparents recount stories like these about their comrades?
So the story of Yang Jingyu, for me, comes into different layers. Of course, there's the official one that all children learn in textbooks. He's the war hero that everyone admires. And then there's the personal second layer of how this person is related personally to my own family, to my grandfather. He was a comrade of my grandfather because they were both in charge of different sectors of the guerrilla armies in Manchuria at the same time. And then to my grandmother, because my grandmother worked as a very young kind of messenger. She worked undercover, so she was delivering secret notes to people and carrying out work there. So once she actually was liaisoning with Yang Jingyu personally and delivered a note to him once.
It's one thing to know a hero passed away. It's a totally different thing to know someone that you know personally just gone.
Of course, Yang Jingyu, the famous story goes that he was tracked down by the Japanese. He was the last man standing in very, very difficult circumstances. Last, he was killed by the Japanese, but the Japanese they couldn't understand how this person could continue to fight by himself without any food or supply. It was just like humans cannot do this. So what they did is that they cut open his body to figure out what was he surviving on, and of course they found twigs and cotton and tree leaves, and that was what he was eating for the last few days of his life. And his head was later on cut off as a trophy by the Japanese. And this connects back to my grandmother. So when the Japanese left, they returned the heads, they cut off many heads of these people, so they returned them to the Chinese authorities. And my grandmother was in charge of this process.
That was when the Japanese already lost the war?
Yes, this was after the war. And it was a very emotional process for her, I think. So they set up a small memorial before they received the proper burial. But the younger people working with my grandma at the institution was quite scared of the presence of having heads in the room. But my grandmother was probably the only one brave enough to kind of take care of the setting. So she would go there inside by herself and look at, I think there were portraits, and she was looking at the faces of these people that she once knew. I can't really understand.
And she cleaned the glasses.
Yes. So and then she was looking at the portraits, and she was dusting the boxes with the heads. So it's I mean, she doesn't talk about it in such a dramatic way. It's just like a small anecdote that you hear growing up, and then you realize how powerful and emotional it is.
War claims people's lives and separates families and friends. Feng Zhongyun and his wife Shui Wen got engaged in their hometown in 1931, and just 3 years later they were forced to be separated. In 1934, Feng decided to join the guerrillas in fighting against Japanese aggression, while Shui headed back to her hometown, Jiangsu, along with her 2 kids. It wasn't until 12 years later that they saw each other again after the Japanese surrendered at the end of World War II.
I mean, now you look at, there's so many TV shows about secret agents at that time, and everyone's watching it, thinking it's the most amazing thing ever. It was really cool. And I'm like, yeah, my grandparents were like that, actually. But I think they were doing this not because it was cool. It was very extremely dangerous, and their members of that group some were in prison, some were captured, some disappeared. It wasn't something fashionable to do at that time. It was, and you never know if the outcome is going to be promising. So I think it was a very courageous thing to do at that time.
Your grandparents were separated for a long period of time during the war. But have your grandma ever talked about her desperation? What was it like for her to go through all of these years on a personal basis?
She had this secret song that she sang.
Really?
There was 2 songs, I think. It was a funny story because they didn't know about this until years later. Other people told each other. So when my grandma was alone to deal with the situation, she would sing a song by herself by the riverside, and the lyrics were kind of reflecting on her situation.
Like what?
That she became this lonesome bird, kind of disconnected from her flock, that she was alone. And then in the lyrics there's also this kind of rumination on, your child, so she had my eldest aunt, and my eldest aunt grew up very fast. And I think my aunt's presence was very important for her because it's a remembrance of those days in Manchuria. and she sent my eldest aunt to join the army. So she thought, oh, maybe if she joins the army, she would be able, through the army system, my aunt can find my grandfather.
It's all about your grandpa.
Yeah, I guess so, yeah. And my grandpa was also singing a song secretly.
Oh, yeah?
When he was at the 88th Brigade, he would like sneak into the woods and sing a song to himself. And all the Korean ladies at would know the song and they would sing it too. So years later, my grandmas met with these ladies and they sang the song, which is a Chinese song from Shanghai. And my grandma was like, how did you learn this song? And they're like, oh yeah, your husband used to sing it all the time when he was thinking about you.
Your grandma must be very touched by then.
Yeah, I think so.
Feng and Shui reunited after 12 years, but many of Feng's comrades never got the chance to meet their loved ones again. Feng promised that he would take care of the children they left behind. The couple helped settle children in schools and, despite surviving on limited means, also took a group of Chinese kids who returned from the former Soviet Union under their wings.
Yeah, I remember it was in the 90s when I was about, I think, 8 or 9 years old, and there was this day that I think almost like 30 of these old grandpas and grandmas came in. They all spoke in heavy Russian accents. They were Chinese, actually. And then they just pushed our sofa aside, our tables aside, right here in this room, put on loud Russian music and started dancing all night and singing. I'm drinking vodka. And
That was a crazy party, isn't it?
it was a crazy party, and my grandma was very delighted. She was so happy that day. And then I asked my mom, like, who are these people? And they said, oh, they're all orphans. They were orphans during the war, or they were separated from their parents. They were left in Russia when they came back to China. My grandmother and grandfather...
Who were their parents?
They were children of parents who were fighting in the war, but couldn't take care of these children, and they were left in the Soviet Union. Some of them are very famous people.
Old Chinese revolutionaries.
Yes, yes. And they came back every year to see my grandma. I think the relationship didn't start when they came back. My grandmother and grandfather, after the war, started this school for war orphans in Harbin. But these children, they were completely Russianized. They only spoke Russian. They ate potatoes, bread, butter. They just couldn't deal with the lifestyle at a Chinese orphanage. So my grandparents made a very important decision, that is to take them all home.
So did you manage to talk to some of these old grandmas and grandpas? Well, maybe they were having the vodka. Or to your grandparents about what war, that war, Second World War, really meant to them?
First of all, they would come in and give me a Russian name. They call me Anya. I think for those people, the children that came back from Russia, it is a strange kind of memory because they were still very, very young. I think coming back to China really was a new life for them. So they didn't talk that much about that period. Of course, they were very young. And my grandmother, there will always be these family anecdotes that runs during dinner at the dinner table. And when you're young, you're kind of like, oh, there's grandma talking that story again. But then when you grow up and really think about it, there are very like emotional, sometimes traumatic, and sometimes very courageous events. Like once my grandma said that during the attack of Nanjing, and her family was on this little boat outside the city, and they were kind of running away from it and trying to like secretly at night take this boat in the river. And then her whole family was on the boat, and then the Japanese soldiers were on the banks and you can hear them. And also there were dead bodies in the river, and they kept on pushing up the boat so you can hear them. So you can feel that kind of fear. And then there was this little girl on the boat that wanted to drink water, and then her grandpa was reaching for that little bottle of water, but it spilled. So to save the whole boat, because this child was crying, he took water from the river that had dead bodies in it to give it to her. So it's just like, my grandma tells the story all the time, and when I was little I was just like, here we go again. But when you grow up and think about it, it's so real, that moment, how to survive and to save the family and all the choices you have to make.
We are so far away from war, but when you look at history, it's actually not that far away. What is it like for you to be raised in a family like this, in which everyone has their wartime stories?
First of all, I grew up with all these pictures in my living room, all these photographs, and grandma telling me about things on the dinner table. You don't really make sense of it once you're a child, you're still home. But it's really when you're leaving, going outside, going to America, and speaking about this history with other people that went through probably the same thing, whether it's in England or America. I mean, there's still veterans out there and relatives of veterans, and they're fascinated by this history that we share together.
And your boyfriend, also coming from a Jewish family, they have very similar stories as well.
My fiance his family is British, but his grandfather, his mother's side, were German Jewish, and in the late 30s, their family escaped Nazi Germany and resettled in England, and then they later on fought against the Germans. So, and then I told them about their family, about my family's history, and they were so fascinated about it, and they wanted to read my grandma's memoir.